Good morning, friends. In Luke chapter 16, verse 13, Jesus teaches, "No servant can serve two masters, for either he will hate the one and love the other, or he will be devoted to the one and despise the other. You cannot serve God and money." Then in verse 14, we read, "The Pharisees, who were lovers of money, heard all these things, and they ridiculed him. And he said to them, 'You are those who justify yourselves before men, but God knows your hearts. For what is exalted among men is an abomination in the sight of God.'" Here we have yet another example of Jesus pointing out the external religiosity of the Pharisees, because they are outright willing to mock Jesus for pointing out the fact that you can't serve both God and money. But that's exactly what the religious system they had established seemed to allow them to do. But again, it was only because it was all external. Their religion had nothing to do with love or faith or the inner motivations of a man's soul in any way other than wickedness. And as we've discussed in these past weeks, their system allowed them to perpetrate that wickedness, to do the most despicable things, taking advantage of their own parents, taking advantage of their kinsmen, even taking advantage of poor and destitute widows, as we saw on Sunday. And yet to do these things and still consider themselves just in the eyes of other men. Now, Jesus doesn't say this part specifically on this occasion, but we know from our examination of the larger picture given throughout the Gospels that the Pharisees and other members of the religious elite justified themselves in the sight of other men who were just like themselves. That if other men who held the same rank, that had the same influence, the same powers they did, all of them being at the top of the heap, as it were, well then, as long as they all said the same thing, it didn't matter what anyone else thought in any case. As long as the people at the top, the people with the power, seemingly, as long as they all agreed that they were justified in their actions, then they were good to go. And that led these men to even greater confidence in themselves and in their status as righteous men. Because again, who were the others declaring them as holy and pious and righteous in their action? Was it not other men who were deemed to be experts in the law, members of the priesthood, the rabbis, the cultural and social influencers of that day? And there was no opposition to this until Jesus came along. And so, once again, if you had these kind of people praising you and declaring your goodness and piety, especially to the rest of society, then what worries could you possibly have? But Jesus takes this opportunity to remind them of something. They could act as if there is only the external matters to take into account, but that doesn't make that reality. For Jesus says, "You are those who justify yourselves before men, but God knows your hearts." God knows your hearts. And something makes me doubt that this was particularly disturbing to the Pharisees on this occasion, but it should have been. Because they could pretend that their righteousness was determined by this rubber stamp that their other friends in high places put on them. But the truth of the matter is that there is one who is truly high and lifted up, exalted above the heavens. And in reality, it is his determination and his determination alone that justifies a person. And yet he looks at and knows the heart, the inner man, the inner person. He searches the inner motives and desires of a person. And in light of that, these men truly do stand in a precarious position indeed. As Jesus explains, "For what is exalted among men is an abomination in the sight of God." Because what do men tend to exalt? Particularly as demonstrated in the present situation with the Pharisees and the other religious elites, they exalt and praise that which is, in reality, incredibly wicked in its sinfulness against God. Again, we consider the way the religious leaders of Israel at this time engaged in such grotesque hypocrisy and corruption, and yet they received the praise of their peers. And yet God finds all that they were doing abominable. Because men have the tendency in their wickedness to call evil good and good evil, to put darkness for light and light for darkness, to put bitter for sweet and sweet for bitter. And Lord willing, we're going to expand on this a bit more tomorrow. But for right now, I just want to give God's people a bit of good news in light of what all of these men do. Because just like in Jesus' day in Israel, we look around us today and we see the same sort of wickedness and corruption in our world. It's certainly in the social and political realm. And yes, a significant portion of the so-called church operates much like the Judaism of first century Israel. But please know this and be encouraged in this. These people calling evil good and good evil, whether they're in the religious realm or the political realm, which unfortunately seems to be meshing together more than what you would think it would nowadays. But they call evil good and good evil, and they do so to the great applause and commendation of many others who act just like they do. And it's not hard for them to find others who will justify what they're doing, justify their claims and their actions. Because there's always a sympathetic fellow expert or fellow elite who will give the validation that they're looking for. Be that as it may, dear brother, dear sister, may I say dear saint, please know that God knows their hearts, that God is sovereign, and that he loves his people. He is the defender and the vindicator of his people, and he has a mighty and glorious and joy-filled purpose for his people to fulfill. So yes, observe the world around you, but do not let it get you down. There may be many people who are being deceived, but God is never deceived. And he is going to use us to bring his people out of deception. Amen? Because he knows the heart. So let's trust him, submit to him, and be about his gospel business. Let's fight the good fight, brothers and sisters, not by force, but by faith and through faith in the one who brings the victory. In light of all this, please do have a good and godly day. And Lord willing, I will see you soon.